Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pondering God. My name is Ron Bay Jr., and today's episode is titled David, the Would-Be King. So, David is a very special character in the Bible, and I've always loved the stories about him. Not just when he was the king, but long before he became the king. Some of the conquests that he did, and it was obviously a special battle with Goliath. But there's something special about David, and it's not because he was a warrior, but there was something about him that was special to God. And so I'm looking into the scriptures to find out what it says about that. So prior to David becoming the king, Saul had separated himself from God because he was on his own agenda. And God basically said, I'm removing this kingdom from your hand. And he's using the prophet Samuel to deliver this message. But here's a couple of verses I want to share that tell you about God's view of David, and then I'll get into what is it that makes David special. So in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, verse 14, it says, "But now your kingdom shall not endure." This is Samuel speaking to King Saul on behalf of God. It says, "The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So Saul was disobedient. Samuel's telling Saul, the kingdom's going to be taken away from you, and he's appointed this guy. And this is speaking about David. Well, later on, Saul gets this message long before the event happens, and King Saul hears this message long before David's been identified. But God knew who he wanted. And so Samuel sent to David's family in Bethlehem, ironically enough, or godly enough, ironically would be wrong, but Bethlehem, a special little village we know from Jesus later on. But Samuel is sent there, and he's going to find this king. And he goes through several sons of Abinadab, or not Abinadab, Jesse. And so Jesse is the father of David, and he's calling all his sons, the older sons, first. And a lot of these sons have been out to war, and they've done great things. Valiant warriors. So every time Jesse sends one of his sons to Samuel, they're rejected. He gets to the very last, at least, of his children, and this is David, who's a teenager. And here's what it says in verse 7 of chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him." And he's talking about these previous brothers. "For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So the earlier verse I read was man of God's own heart, a description of who he's chosen. And then right here it says God looks at the heart. So what is it about King David's heart? What is it that makes King David a man after God's own heart? What makes him so special? What characteristics does he have? And I think as Christians, we would be very wise to seek these attributes out for ourselves. And what is it that God expects from us? So there's two stories I think that really tell a lot about David's heart. There's many of them in Scripture, but these two are very specific to me about what makes David so special and why God viewed him the way he did. So Saul's been told by Samuel, the prophet, that the kingdom is going to be removed from his hand. And Saul knows this. And then he knows it's David who's going to be the one that takes his place. Has no idea how long it's going to take, how many years have to go by. It could be tomorrow, it could be whenever. He doesn't know these things. But because he knows this, Saul is jealous, and he tries to kill David on several occasions. And one occasion, David's best friend Jonathan, who happens to be King Saul's son, gets between those two and basically saves David's life. And they make a pact together and a covenant together, those two. Later on in 1 Samuel, there are other instances where King David or King Saul has his armies and they're out fighting the Philistines, and David also has his men and they're out fighting the Philistines. And when there's a break in the action, it seems like Saul says, okay, I know where David is now. I'm going to go find him and kill him. So here's a story from 1 Samuel chapter 24, another instance where King Saul is trying to kill David. So here's the story. I'm going to read the first 7 verses and then I'll read a few more. It came about when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, saying, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Aha, I know where he is. Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. Okay? He came to the sheepfolds on the way. There was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Your imagination can take you there where you want to go on that one. But David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of that same cave. So here comes Saul, goes into this dark cave to relieve himself, and guess who's sitting in there hiding from Saul at this time is David. And the men of David said to him, behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. The men are all over this. They're like, David, this is a perfect opportunity. You can kill Saul, who's been trying to kill you for all these years. Here's what David did. David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. So he sneaks up to him in the dark. Whatever Saul's doing, you can, like I said, use your imagination. David cuts off a part of his robe. And it came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my Lord, his reverence for God's anointed king, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. So here's a piece of David's character that we can see. He recognizes that Saul is anointed by God king, and he says, far be it from me to take his life from him. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. Saul arose, left the cave, and went on his way. So, jump forward a couple of verses here. Verse 8. Now afterward David arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, saying, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and prostrated himself, as he would have for the king. David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men, saying, behold, David seeks to harm you? Behold, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord had given you today into my hand in the cave, and some said to kill you. But my eye had pity on you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Now my father, see, indeed, see the edge of your robe in my hand? For in that I cut off the edge of your robe and did not kill you. Know and perceive that there is no evil or rebellion in my hands. And I have not sinned against you, though you are lying in wait for my life to take it. And verse 12, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. So all this time, Saul's being told, whispered in his ear from his guys, that David's out to kill you. David is saying to Saul right here, I had the opportunity, a perfect opportunity to take your life. And here's the edge of your robe to prove that I had that opportunity. And yet I didn't do it. You are the Lord's anointed king. I'm not. Although he's anointed for later, right? He knows he's going to be the king, but he just doesn't know when. In the meantime, he respects God. Whereas King Saul has his kingship removed because of his own agenda, David's agenda is God's agenda. That's one of the reasons why I think he's special. He respects God's anointed king, even a king that's trying to kill him. Fast forward a few more verses here, verses 16 through 20, or 16 through 19. It came about when David had finished speaking these words to Saul that Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? Then Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have dealt well with me, while I have dealt wickedly with you. And you have declared today that you have done good to me, that the Lord delivered me into your hand, and yet you did not kill me. So Saul's kind of humbled at this point, and he tells David, you're more righteous than I. So David extended some things, qualities there, I think, that number one, obviously it's I said earlier that his agenda is God's agenda. David is all about God's agenda. But secondly, he extended mercy to Saul. Even though Saul was out to kill him, David extended mercy and kindness. And those are traits of David, I believe, that are also indicative of God saying he's a man after my own heart. So let's go to another chapter. That's the first story. And the second one is from 2 Samuel. So this is, we move forward 15 years. By this time, Saul is gone. Saul has been killed. Maybe he took his own life in battle. His son Jonathan has been killed, David's best friend. And so now David's the king 15 years later. And this story is from 2 Samuel chapter 9. And the title of this is, and it's hard for me to pronounce this guy's name, but I'm going to try my best. David's kindness to Mephibosheth. Okay, who is Mephibosheth? Well, let's read the story here. In 2 Samuel 9, verse 1, David said, "Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I might show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." The king said, "Is there not yet any one of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And Ziba said to the king, "There's still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet." So the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, so Saul's grandson, came to David, fell on his face, and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he said, "Here is your servant." David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly." And the story goes on to say that he took care of him for the rest of his life. It says Mephibosheth, in verse 13, lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. Now he was lame in both feet. So what David is saying here, he made a promise to Jonathan earlier on, whenever they made their covenant with one another, and Jonathan protected him from Saul. Later, though, when David, at this very scene, when he's has this opportunity to kill King Saul in the cave, and he cuts off part of his robe, and Saul finally admits to David that you're more righteous than I. There's 3 more verses that I want to read here at the very end of that chapter. It says, and this is Saul speaking to David, "Now behold, I know that you shall surely be the king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. So now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's household." And David swore to Saul, and Saul went up to his home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So this instance is when David recognizes Saul's grandson and his friend Jonathan's son who's crippled, and decides, I'm going to take care. He actually went out to find any relative of David or of Saul and Jonathan, because he wanted to show kindness to them, and he did. He found this Mephibosheth who was crippled. But it goes back to this promise. Not only did he promise Jonathan, he also promised King Saul that he would take care of his family and make sure they weren't removed from the face of the earth. So what is it that makes David a man after God's own heart? I think loyalty. He's loyal. He's all about God's agenda, but he's loyal to the king, even an evil king who was trying to kill him. He extends kindness and mercy and compassion. David is full of compassion. And so there's some verses here that I want to refer to, and it talks about these particular qualities. And one of those is from Micah chapter 6. So Micah 6 verse 8. I want to find that while I'm looking for it here. It's one of the last books of the Old Testament, anyway. And it has one particular verse in there that stuck with me for all of my walk with the Lord, and I think it's a very important verse. Micah chapter 6, verse 8, and it says, the title of this section of chapter 6, it says, "What God Requires of Man." And it's talking about all these things that a man could do to please the Lord. But here's what the prophet Micah says. "He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" I think those words that Micah proclaimed there are applicable to you and me, but also describe what King David was all about: justice and mercy and walking humbly with God. Then there's another passage in Matthew chapter 23 where Jesus is berating the scribes and Pharisees for the opposite reason. He says to them, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." And this faithfulness, I think, reflects exactly the opposite of Saul. Saul was not faithful. He was on his own agenda. David was faithful. He was all about God's agenda. So you have King Saul, who recognizes David as God's anointed one who's going to replace him, and yet he's trying to kill him. On the other side, you have David, who recognizes Saul as God's anointed one, and he spares his life. That tells you that King David was all about God's agenda. He was righteous. He was all about kindness and mercy and compassion, and Saul was not about any of these things. So that's the lesson I have for you today, and that's the lesson I have for me today, that we should be all about justice, mercy, kindness, compassion, and our agenda should be God's agenda, just like it was for King David. And that's what, to me, those qualities are what makes King David so special, that the scripture would say he was a man after God's own heart, and that God looked in David's heart and he saw these things. Even when King David was standing before, he wasn't even King David yet, he was the teenager David, was standing before this giant Goliath. He knew that it was God's agenda, for God would take care of this for him. It wasn't out of David's might and power. It was God that would take care of not only Goliath, but the rest of the Philistines that they're in battle with. So consider these words of mine. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like this particular video, if you go to the YouTube, you'll see below the video a subscribe button. Please subscribe, and you'll get more of these. And also like it if you would, or you can make comments or whatever if you'd like to. But again, thank you for listening to me this day, and have a great day.